Morning. Um, our psalm for the day is Psalm number 63. O God, you are my God. Early I will seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh also longs after you, in a dry and barren land where no water is. Thus have I looked for you in your sanctuary, that I may see your power and glory. For your loving kindness is better than life itself. My lips will praise you. As long as I will live, I will magnify you in this way. I will lift up my hands to your name. My soul will be satisfied with marrow and fat. My mouth praises you with joyful lips. Have I not remembered you in my bed and thought about you when I was waking up? Because you have been my helper. Under the shadow of your wings, I will give praise. My soul hangs on you. Your right hand upholds me. Those also seek hurt for my soul. They will go down to the earth. Let them fall on the edge of the sword, that they may be a portion for foxes. The king shall rejoice in God, for all that swear by him will be praised, for the mouth of those that speaks lies will be silenced. The word of the Lord. So today is I think a last in a series of lectures that's talking about kind of the transformation of Europe in really the West, but especially these are Europe-focused lectures. We talked about Napoleon, we talked about industrialism, and now I want to talk today about a complex philosophical figure named Immanuel Kant. Kant, I'll tell you this life story, but honestly, his life story is really quite boring. He doesn't do an awful lot as far as lives go. I mean, the life of a Plato or a Cicero or even an Aquinas is a little bit more exciting. And yet he's probably considered the greatest of all modern philosophers. Most of what's happened in the last 200 years has sort of descended from him, especially in idealism. If you like most of modern thought, you probably take your bearings from Kant. And if you are disenchanted with most of modern thought, you maybe ought to ask yourself if you think Kant was wrong, and maybe we have to go back to this space to sort of reimagine. Kant is difficult, let's say. So let's start with his life. So he's born in East Prussia, in a little town called Königsberg. It's in East Prussia, which means that it's on really the eastern edge of what would have been kind of Enlightenment Europe. Beyond Germany or beyond Prussia to the east lie Polish territory, Lithuanian territory, Russian territory, and a space where the ideas of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and the Reformation hadn't much been seen. This is the most conservative part of Germany. It's a port town, so it's in connection with what's happening in the broader world. Today, this is actually Königsberg in what's today actually Russia. Very different place. Kant's background is actually tremendously important. Kant is from a traditional German, sorry, technical glitch. Kant is from a traditional German pietist family. The pietists who were in some ways the inspiration behind the Wesleyan revivals. So they were theologically traditional, but their deep emphasis was on the condition of the heart, and that to be genuinely a follower of Christ, one had to have right hearts and not just right theology. When Wesley talked about this is what Wesley talked about aggressively, is being perfected in Christian love. The affections need to be centered. So Kant grew up in this environment. His family were artisans. They made harnesses. They were Lutheran, but this was a Lutheranism that focused it intensely on affection and right behavior, almost Quaker in terms of their seriousness and their level of rigor. Kant never marries. He twice kind of has long-term attachments to women, but never quite brings himself to the place where it works out. And he spends the rest of his life in Königsberg as a student of philosophy, as a teacher of philosophy, and finally as a professor of philosophy. The intellectual kind of experience he describes in his youth in the 1760s is really the experience of reading David Hume's Skeptical Enlightenment. Um, and he describes his phrase is that he's awakened from his dogmatic slumber. And he begins to question himself. He becomes then a lecturer at the university at Königsberg. Professorships are very, very difficult to attain, but he taught classes there. And if you didn't have a chair in philosophy, you would spend 20 or 30 hours a week really lecturing. My position requires me to lecture 12, and it's actually considered quite onerous by the standards of the modern academy. When I was in grad school, my professors would lecture for 6 hours. Kant did 20 to sometimes as much as 30. And on a wide range of subjects, on geology, on mathematics, on the natural sciences, on metaphysics, on philosophy. He was sort of a bit of a polymath. And when he was young, this gives you a sense of his, his cerebral nature, maybe, like the limits of it. When he was young, he made so little money at his lectures that he would supplement it by playing pool and playing cards, and sort of doing rather unpietistic things. But he was a man of rigorous habit. He would get up in the morning and he would write, and then he would do his lecturing and work with the students. And every day at 3:30, he would get up from his chair. He would walk around his neighborhood, and his walks were so regular that the housewives of his neighborhood were said to, apocryphally, they were said to set their clocks by his afternoon walk. He wrote two major works. He wrote, half a dozen other significant pieces, but two works that each in and of themselves would have shattered philosophy. So twice over, he deserves kind of to be considered the father of modern philosophy. Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, after he'd become, when he becomes a professor, I think in about 1770, he doesn't do much for about a decade, and he begins to kind of work over this problem of the Enlightenment and the place of science within the Enlightenment, begins to question it. In 1781, his Critique of Pure Reason emerges, and I'll describe that. And then the second is a piece that I'm having you read about a page and a half of, I think, Foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals, in which he really lays the groundwork for modern ethics. And then finally, I'm going to have you read a piece longer, in which he kind of describes international ethics. And I think this is actually more easy to read. Kant describes his own work as, quote, dry, obscure, contrary to all ordinary ideas. And on top of that, prolix, which means verbose. So the critique and the foundations of the metaphysics of morals are, from my point of view, very, very difficult to read. They surpass Aristotle in their density. So I'm not going to have you do much with that, but I think his applied ethics are actually particularly easy to get at. And so we'll kind of talk about his principles in this mini lecture, and then we'll have a discussion in which primarily we'll talk about his theory of international relations and peace. And here I'll talk especially about his idea of a nation as a way to kind of break out to a concept that's particularly important in 19th century Europe. Okay, so the first thing is to talk about his Critique of Pure Reason and his work on metaphysics. So this is his first kind of earth-shattering book, the Critique of Pure Reason. And this is one of those books like Newton's Principia. When it comes out, it's so technical that people don't really understand what Kant is doing. He sends it to a friend and says, please, I need feedback. These ideas have been rattling around in my head. Tell me what you think. And after a long time, his friend returns the manuscript unfinished. Friend says, kind of writes apologetically, look, I can't read any more of this. If I go on till the end, I'm afraid I shall go mad, right? So I've done a lot in the first few minutes here to kind of suggest that Kant is dense and difficult to access. But that said, like, we have to understand Kant because he is, in some ways, the foundation of philosophy in the modern age. And the course is a course that purports to teach you a little bit about philosophy. So I'm going to suggest what I think is happening here. In the age before Kant, Enlightenment philosophers had been of two minds about the nature of reality. They were engaged in this debate. So you have philosophers who were they called themselves empiricists, like Locke, who believed that human nature was a blank slate and that everything that we knew because of sense perception. We receive from our education, and it fully shapes us and kind of makes us who we are. And there was a countervailing school of thought where they emphasize kind of that in fact, there are innate ideas, and that these innate ideas are logical and rational. And so the making of the modern world ought to be the logical enrolling of ideas. And the two positions had sort of argued each other to exhaustion by the 1780s. So Kant comes along and he reads Hume, and he recognizes that, oh, so there's something to be said for Hume's argument. We need to be deeply skeptical of all rational. But in fact, there are places where we can talk about having certainty. They're just rare, and we should acknowledge them where we can, right? So Kant's major contribution in metaphysics, or the nature of the way things really are, it's another way to think about metaphysics. Excuse me. We say there are two worlds, both real and both rational, but they operate by different principles. There's a phenomenal world, which is the world Locke describes, things the way that we perceive them. And there's a noumenal world of the things themselves. And so there is an independent reality. Now, everything isn't just kind of based on our perceptions. Things are real, but that we think about these things in different ways, right? Another way to kind of back up from this is to ask yourself the philosophers, or like the hack kind of, if you're having a session with your friends, I don't know if it's on Zoom or if you're sitting around the dorm late at night, and you sort of, we would argue these questions like this. The question about, like, can you know the nature of reality is, if a tree falls in the forest, no one to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, the phenomenologist would say no. Our reality is created by our perception of things. And the realist, the noumenalist, would say, yes, of course. And Kant wants to say, well, yes, like the tree falls, it does make a sound, but the sound is philosophically meaningless unless we hear it and interpret it. Okay, so these, when you get to application, then they're going to be fundamentally two kinds of knowledge. And the difference between these two kinds of knowledge has then a massive impact in terms of the way the modern world unfolds, right? So there's the world of moral philosophy, where we think about right and wrong, and that really is shaped by our experiences and our perspectives. And it requires a great deal of labor to build it, where we come to these arguments, positions like things like where we say suicide is wrong. Well, how do we know it's wrong? Well, we think about what we know about humanity, what we know about human nature, but that's a different kind of statement than to say 2 + 2 is 4. Now, that doesn't mean that 2 + 2 is 4. That doesn't mean that's a relative statement. I mean, that statement really is absolutely true. It's hard to think of a world, for instance, in which 2 + 2 is 4 wouldn't be true in all times, in all places, independently of whether we perceive it or not. You could sort of be locked in your room in the middle of the quarantine and have no contact with the outside world and still sort of reason your way without sense perception to this idea that 2 + 2 is 4. But most of what we know in life, Kant says, comes from this idea, things we reason with, kind of with our limited perspective. So you would think that this is a profoundly skeptical notion. And this was Hume's insight. This is the insight of a lot of Enlightenment skepticism, to say most of what we've sort of inherited from the past, either from tradition or from the classics or from religion, those sorts of declaration that these principles are true in all times and all places really can't be said to. We can't know that for sure. And so they don't rest on certainty, right? So the Enlightenment sort of had contained in itself this attack on the traditions of the past. Here's what Kant does that's devastating. He takes that skepticism and he applies it to reason itself. and subjects reason to critical scrutiny, in particular, science. Because going back to Hobbes and Locke and Galileo and Newton, the project of the scientific enlightenment was to say these principles of science that Newton has discovered, these principles of matter and motion, they can be applied to the problems of political morality, and we can come up with natural laws that will tell us what to do. So this is a sort of devastating problem that the Enlightenment had been grappling with, right? Especially in an age of religious war and Reformation, in which we no longer share a shared sense of what is revelation and where does religious authority lie in Christendom, right? Now, some people have kind of posited the answer of absolutism as the kind of, well, maybe, I think Hobbes suggests this. Maybe if we don't have moral clarity, we can all agree that we live better lives, realistically, if we give all of our power to the sovereign, and the sovereign will just protect us, and we don't need to trouble ourselves with these metaphysical things, right? And some of us probably feel that way after thinking about Kant for 10 minutes. And so that's the approach of the social contracts theorists, and that was a prevailing approach during the Enlightenment at the time of when Kant comes along. We talked about last semester, if you were in another section, or maybe you skipped one or two, that Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau were the three kind of social contractarian answers to this question. And they would say, well, we can agree on what morality is. We have this capacity as humans to know it kind of scientifically. Although Rousseau would say maybe feel rather than know. There's another prevailing approach that we haven't much talked about, that we'll allude to later as we talk about the development of liberalism. But in the mid 18th century, there was an Englishman named Jeremy Bentham that developed a sort of scientific alternative to rationalism. And he would say, no, the way to think about this is less about kind of what we can reason to scientifically, mechanistically. But morality is actually fairly simple. It's about what's good for people. It's about what makes people happy. And it's not about them individually. It's about them sort of collectively. So there's a phrase that Joseph Priestley uses. Priestley was a famous Unitarian chemist that Bentham picks up. What's going to be give the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. And that's something that Bentham says you could calculate, right? Well, if it would make more people happy to take the wealth of the monarch and redistribute it to the masses, maybe that ought to be done, right? And the sort of utilitarian approach to morality might be something that we eventually would kind of apply when we talk about Marx, right? And the communist revolutions. And utilitarian ethics is attractive, I think, to political planners, but it really bothers philosophers. Philosophers kind of want to say, well, then you're judging the rightness or wrongness of an action by its consequences, right? So it becomes morally right to murder someone if it's going to make everyone happy. Is it right to pick on the weak if it's going to make the majority happy, right? Is it, in fact, is what Hitler does to the Jews wrong if it makes 90% of Germans happy? And I mean, there are a lot of complicated nuances, but this is sort of state of moral philosophy. You've got traditional religious answers, you've got the classical tradition, and you've got these two developing modern answers. And Kant comes along and posits a dramatically different answer to the question, one that's trying to preserve individual morality, and to preserve an individual morality that we could all share as humans. And because it's the foundation of modern liberal ethics, I think it's worth approaching, even though the reading is quite difficult. So I've given you a page of this, and I want you to wrestle a little bit with the ideas at work, okay? The first line in the piece is, I don't think I gave it to you, but the first line is, nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a good will. Let's take that and unpack that line. Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification, except a good will. So Kant is meditating on the nature of goodness. And he says that we are good, not necessarily objectively, but we're good when we're good inside of our wills. What makes us good is the choice that we make. Will something or not to will something. So this Kant presupposes, and this is a massive presupposition. He presupposes it really because he feels like it has to be. In order for us to have morality, we must have free will. And the need for morality is so overwhelming that this almost proves that there's free will. This replaces science as the foundation of morality. The fact that human beings are free and rational, and that we have this equal capacity to make choices, right? So this is something that Plato and Aristotle agreed that philosophers had, right? We have these desires and these appetites and these cravings that we all share. And then we can develop this capacity for spiritedness or courage. Kant does almost nothing with that. That's sort of missing from his anthropology, and I think it's really problematic. But he does say, the philosophers would say, well, we have this capacity to use our minds, to use courage to inspire us, to overcome our desires. Kant, in contrast, would say, no, this is pure reason. This is the sort of phenomenal mind. Every human being that's fully human has the capacity to distinguish between our desires and pleasures and our duty. And if you can't make that distinction, Kant says, you're either a barbarian or a child, which gives you a sense of the way that his mind works. There's full humanness, and then there are people in a tutelary state, uncivilized peoples or children. And the goal is to sort of progress then would mean enlightenment progress would be bringing people out of this state of kind of development and into the full capacity of using their minds to do their duty. Because of this focus on duty, it's Kant's ethics is called, the fancy word is deontological ethics, which basically just means duty-based ethics. And so I've given you an excerpt where he kind of talks about how this works, how this exercise of reason works, and with the example of suicide, which I want to talk about a little bit when we have our discussion. But let me walk you through kind of two of the core principles at work here. So the idea is that we use our reason to figure out what the right thing to do is. It's a perspectival reason, because sometimes we use our reason and there's not a general good of humanity, right? There is I, Chris Esch, am hungry, I'm thirsty, I have a headache, and so what I really need is coffee. So what kind of command ought I to listen to? And Kant would say, well, in this situation, there's a hypothetical imperative because not everyone may have a headache and not everyone needs coffee, right? I need coffee. And so there's a rule that ought to be applied so that I can achieve my specific end, which is coffee. And so I can reach out my hand and take my coffee mug. And I can feel better, right? So that's my hypothetical imperative, right? It's a rule that I follow to achieve a specific end, which is coffee, right? But that's not a moral law, right? A moral law can't be hypothetical, right? And you really can't, I can't have moral knowledge of myself because I'm biased, right? This is a point that Locke makes, and I think Kant believes that Locke is right. No person is a fit judge of their own cause, right? So how much coffee do I need? Well, I would say, well, I need infinite coffee, right? How much coffee would really be enough for someone like me? Like I need all the coffee in all the world, right? It's all mine. And you can give it to me. That's fine. Kant would say, well, actually, that's not a moral imperative, right? So there's the second category of reasoning that's moral, and that deals with all of humankind. And he would call that the categorical imperative, right? And that's where we think about what's good for all of humanity, right? And all of humanity might not be, the need might not be coffee, right? because that's not everyone's in. I mean, maybe someone has a heart condition, right? If my wife has coffee after about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she's up late into the night, and like that's not a good thing, right? And so we don't necessarily like apply all of the rules to coffee, but there are rules that he's going to say that we can reason to, right? And it's worth asking. He says, if there is a categorical imperative, because it's maybe like the question, these might be limited, but it must be one which, being drawn from the conception of that which is necessary, an end for everyone, because it is an end in itself. Here we need to think a little bit about what is an end, what ends are, what is the purpose of something, right? Now, purposiveness has been sort of divorced from ethics by science, because these were things that not Aristotle, Hobbes and Galileo and Locke taught that science couldn't really lead us toward these things. And so, what is our purpose really? I mean, well, it's going to be reduced to biological things for Hobbes, and basically say, well, the purpose is survival. Or Locke is going to say, well, it's about property, so maybe the purpose is to get rich. And Kant's going to say, no, these are too shallow. This is what I like about Kant's ethics. Kant's going to say these materialistic things are actually too shallow. The end is actually kind of humanity itself. Now, you might question, if you're a devout Christian, whether or not humanity ought to be the end in of itself, right? Whether this might not create a certain kind of humanism if perfectly implemented. But if humanity was in itself an end, right? And human dignity was the highest possible good, then you can begin to form a moral theory in which stealing might be wrong, murder might be wrong, and even suicide might be wrong, right? Because it's not about like who are you harming or who are you, but like, but this is something that's actually that does violence to, you're not just thinking about it from the point of view of self-interest, you're thinking about it from the point of view. And because Kant believed every full human had the capacity to make this mental leap, to think about the good, their duty to the whole of humanity rather than just what's in their self-interest. Morality is then possible. And so the moral person is the person who acts for humanity rather than just for themselves. This is a major shift in moral philosophy, right? And it attempts to sort of give a grounding, especially in a secularizing age where religion, for German and French and English intellectuals, is losing some of its moral authority, to give a grounding to our theories of right and wrong that we could share, maybe independent of our specific point of view. Let me kind of talk a little bit about the last piece that we're going to look at. We'll probably spend most of our time in conversation talking about this, and then I want to briefly conclude with some remarks on why Kant matters. But I'm going to have you read a piece on Perpetual Peace. It's in my edition, it's about 10 pages. It's not especially long. My picture's in the way of the title here. It should say Liberal International Ethics, right? But Kant thinks that ethics can be applied not just to individuals, but to the problems of peace in the Napoleonic Wars. Now, he writes this in 1795, before Napoleon fully comes to power. So he's in love with revolutionary France. He thinks that the revolution represents the culmination. It's messy, but it's moving forward. It's moving humanity out from under superstition. People are freeing themselves from the tutelage of monarchs, and they're working toward a space where Europe could be at peace. So we'll talk through this. These are just sort of reading discussion questions, right? I want you to think through what does he mean by peace? How could we have it? What might peace mean for a liberal nation, right? Especially a nation who could think rationally about a categorical imperative like peace for all mankind, rather than we're just going to do what's in our interest, right? The moral nation is going to choose what's good for humanity rather than just what's in their self-interest, right? And this category of nation doesn't exist in ancient, classical, or even Christian natural, legal thinking to some ways. It's like this is a newer idea. Where does this come from? What is this, right? And if we accept that morality is in the international sphere is done by nations, then what prevents peace? Do nations ever get to make war on one another? And in particular, what makes international ethics possible? Like, so to think about this also in terms of the question, like, well, what makes ethics possible? What makes ethics possible, remember, is the fact that every human creature has an equal capacity to think about what's good for the whole of the human race, rather than to just operate based on their desires or to calculate based on what's in their self-interest rationally, right? Ethics is about this leap to think about the categorical imperative. Well, what is the categorical imperative for the community of nations? And what makes it possible to think about, right? So we'll talk about that. Um, I want to help you understand at the end, though, what makes it possible. So we'll go back to this picture of Kant, right? Why does this guy matter so much? Because this is dense and abstract and highly theoretical. The thing that really is path breaking is that Kant displaces the idea that ethics and philosophy ought to be based on a mechanistic, deterministic view of science, where everything is operated by laws like matter in motion, the Newtonian mechanics, right? Kant wants to displace that kind of philosophy with a new philosophy, a philosophy that puts its highest value on human freedom, the freedom of the will, and individual autonomy. This is crucial to the way modern liberal democracy operates, right? Now, there are plenty of people I would consider as an essential part of liberal democracy, people like Thomas Jefferson, people like Abraham Lincoln, people like Alexis de Tocqueville, who don't necessarily work in this way. So when we talk about American conception of liberalism, it's going to look a little bit different than Kant. But liberalism as it develops on the continent really has this sense of individualism, right? And of moral individualism. It's good. This makes it possible for a secular denunciation of slavery and exploitation. Up until this moment, the primary attacks on the institution of slavery had been religious, by pietists, by Wesleyans, by Quakers. Kant wants to come up with a secular moral critique of slavery. So he thinks that given that everyone has this equal capacity, that slavery is a degradation of someone's capacity. It's denying someone the ability to make that moral choice, right? This then, I don't think I would call Kant a full-blown romantic. His view of nature is certainly different. But this is so essential. Kant lays the foundation for romanticism as it emerges as a major literary and philosophical force in the modern world, right? The romantic is going to emphasize the courageous act of the free moral individual. You see the truth and you're willing to sacrifice everything for it, right? If you think about I think about romanticism, I think about Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Think about them. And if you know the musical, you can sort of imagine, do you hear the people singing the songs of angry men? This is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. When the beating of your heart echoes the beat, and I can't really think. But like that's a courageous moral individual, right? Who sees the truth and is willing to sacrifice their life and everything they possess for it. That's a moral choice. And the revolution is going to praise these people. Now, Kant would have been horrified by violence and the thought of killing other people in the name of humanity. Like he didn't care for that. But this makes something possible, right? This is a sense of morality less restrained by society, and really, this is the complete unlocking of one's own conscience becomes the key to what's right. He's not fully romantic. Kant believes that we are essentially rational creatures, that this can be calculated, right? He's not in love with nature as the standard of truth and beauty. Nature for him is really more inert stuff that the human mind works on. He's like, just like he doesn't go out and enjoy the natural world so much. He takes one walk a day through his neighborhood, 3:30, and that's it. What's moral then is legislation. So liberalism is going to prize politics, making moral choices to set people free. In the British liberal tradition, It can be piecemeal. It can be gradual. Think about kind of how international peace is going to be gradually created in the peace that I'm assigning. Um, he thinks this is a major moment, right? So science is no longer the standard. Nature is no longer the standard. Well, what is the standard? Our consciences. It's the bastion of what's right. So this really helps to create, I think, the moral world that we live in today. Kant's divide between phenomenal and noumenal is in our shape today. It's this sort of division between facts and values, which I mean, you're not freshmen anymore, so we need to sort of move beyond it. But it's the first thing I tell my free history freshmen, right? Well, you're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts. These are different kinds of things. A fact is what it is. 2 + 2 is 4. An opinion is something that's subjective, and you're welcome to the idea that there's subjective knowledge and objective knowledge, and if they're not the same kind of thing. This is a notion that Aristotle would have thought was nonsense. And I think Locke would have too. But this idea, the profound subjectivity of the human creature, is in many ways Kant's problem. And he convinces of this, and then constructs this elaborate ethics as a way to say, but a properly reasoning person can still have morality. And this is the world that we live in today. Like, well, Kant is a figure that we'll circle back to quite a bit. If you don't feel like you understand him, don't sweat it. Just read the piece and come to a discussion prepared to sort of wrestle with this, and hopefully we can make more sense of it. All right? Good.